Hi there, and welcome back to the Energy Sector Heroes podcast. My name is Michelle Fraser, and every week I will speak with incredible people who share their lessons, experiences, and stories from their time spent in the energy sector. Hi there, and welcome back again to this week's episode. If you're new to the show, then please take a second to subscribe and even consider sharing the show with just one other person. This week I am joined by Daniel Meara. Daniel is the president of Geo2 Flow. Daniel, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. As you say, I'm the president of a company called Geo2 Flow. I founded my company back in 1992, so it's been in business for 34 years. And it's a software company largely. And we've had 3 products on the market over time. And the current one's been on the market for about 20 years. The first one was on the market for about a dozen years. The software has been used by about 75 companies worldwide. So we're a small company in San Antonio, Texas, and it kind of amazes me nowadays that a small company can have such a large reach, as to be used by 75 companies. So that's life in today's world.
It's quite amazing, actually. I've got quite a lot of questions I can ask you. I was going to ask you first, how did you get started off in the energy sector?
Well, I never thought I would be in the energy sector because I went to Princeton University, got a PhD in chemical engineering. And chemical engineering, if you're in the energy sector, you're probably in a refinery and you're not thinking about producing oil and gas reservoirs like I am. And so my advisor at Princeton worked for Shell. And I took an interview at Shell down in Houston, Texas. And I had been to Houston once in my life. It was so hot and humid that I thought there's never a chance I'm going to live here. But I went down to Shell and the people were so enthusiastic about what they were doing and so smart and asking a lot of good questions when I gave my seminar that I thought, this is a company I want to join. And so that was the introduction to the energy sector. Now, luckily at Shell, in their research center there, they had a fellow who had worked before I was there. His name was Gus Archie. And people in the oil industry know his name because there are 2 equations named after him having to do with how you interpret resistivity measurements in a reservoir to figure out whether there's water or oil or gas in there. And so he's pretty well known. And Archie was a guy who thought that it was a good idea in research to hire people who were good in the sciences or engineering, but not necessarily trained in petroleum. So it was because of him that the Shell Research Center brought in people like me. I have a friend who had done a PhD thesis at MIT, and he did it in chemical physics. And his whole thesis was one unforgiving page of equations after another. And yet he joined Shell and became a well-known experimentalist. And in fact, when I joined Shell, I did experiments in the beginning. Another friend of mine got a PhD in physics from Harvard. He said the only place he ever wanted to work as a boy growing up was the place his uncle worked, which was at the Shell Research Center in Houston, Texas. So there are a lot of people with disparate backgrounds, disparate degrees, coming from the East, as I did. I come from Boston originally, who had never been to Texas, who found themselves working in the energy sector. So that was not unusual at Shell, whereas other companies would hire people who had been trained classically in petroleum engineering, petroleum geology, petroleum geophysics. But Shell had a different attitude. They thought that if they brought people in that had a good bag of tools, they could apply them in the oil industry. And that paid off big time, I think, for Shell over the years.
I was going to ask you one question. You've had an amazing career. I just wondered, how have you managed to keep your company almost going for over 30 years? That's an achievement in itself. Hardly anybody gets there.
It is pretty remarkable because so many companies fail. And I guess when I was at Shell, everything was inward looking. We thought we were at the top of the heap. And when we attended technical meetings, the room might be empty and a Shell person would come in to speak, and the room would fill up with kind of standing room only. So we were led to believe that we were pretty good at what we were doing. But then after Shell, I joined British Petroleum, which compared to Shell was chaotic. And I led a team there that included geologists, not in my discipline, geophysicists, and petrophysicists. So that got me looking outward into other disciplines. And more importantly, because of BP's chaos and because they didn't have the heritage and research that Shell did, they were more outward looking. And so I started to look at what the rest of the world was doing and made an attempt to dive in to work with other companies. And I found it a lot of fun. And so BP was kind of the introduction to the rest of the oil industry. And in fact, I got them, they decided to fund a project that I was working on at BP. They had spent about $10 million on it, and they gave me money to go bring the project to the University of Oklahoma. And so I started a research group at the University of Oklahoma, funded through BP, and Oklahoma came up with money. And then for those of people outside the United States, they may not know that every state gets two senators, no matter what the population is in the state. Oklahoma doesn't have many people, but it has two senators. And one of them decided that what I was doing at the University of Oklahoma was worthwhile. So we actually had a line item in the federal budget that said, you will send X amount of dollars to the University of Oklahoma for this project. And so that got me started there. And I pretty much brought in the whole attitude of working with multidisciplines, which is much rarer at a university than it is in industry. So to get the math department, which I had people working on, and to get geology, geophysics, engineering all cooperating is a more daunting task, believe it or not, at a university where the disciplines are pretty siloed than it is in industry. But it got me also started with my company at the same time. And I started to do a fair bit of consulting with the software I was producing. And that got me to see a lot of fields around the world. So there's probably not too many countries in the world that I haven't worked in. So I think I've seen fields all over the place, whether it's Russia, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, the North Sea, whether it's Norway or the UK, Russia, all over Latin America, in a lot of parts of Africa. So that's the software reached those places, and I naturally started to work on fields that were in those places.
Okay. When you were going from a almost a corporate company into starting up your own company, did you find it hard? Did you find it daunting? How did you take the first step?
Not as bad as I think I thought it could be, because I tend to be pretty gregarious and extroverted. And that pays off because I look at a lot of colleagues or contemporaries of mine who've been in the industry as long, and they've worked for a company for, say, 30 years. And then sadly, they maybe get early retired and they're out on the street and they're not really ready to retire. But the thing that they haven't developed working in a company for 30 or 35 years are marketing and sales. So they have no idea really how to effectively sell themselves. And that's kind of sad to see because they're at the end of their career, they're at the height of their powers, and yet they're not able to get the word out. And fortunately for me, I started to develop that much earlier in life. And so I look at those people now and go, they ask me when I want to retire, and the answer is probably never, because I love what I do. And it turns out my wife works with me. And so when we travel as a couple, not the typical oil man who goes into a country for a week without his wife. And in fact, she's so good at the software herself that she's actually advising companies on what to do with their fields. She probably knows more about some fields than the people inside the company know. So that was a happy circumstance that the two of us can kind of do this together.
No, that's amazing. So when you travel to different sites all over the world, do you find that different areas, different locations engineer or produce oil in a different way? Or do you find it similar?
There are certainly some regional differences, yes. I would say that sometimes some countries hire a lot of expats.
Mm.
And so the kind of stuff that I do kind of challenges the status quo. And if you put yourself in the position of an expat who's getting paid very well because maybe you've had a 30-year career in the industry and you're now sitting in the Middle East and you're getting respected by the manager who's paying you well. So it's a self-referential system. You don't want to be paying somebody too well who you don't respect. So you respect the person you pay. And that person, you have to ask yourself, are they willing to change their ways after, say, 30 plus years in the industry when they're seen as an expert? And the answer is not really. And so that's one of the key regional differences that I see. In some places, people just go for the science, like if I'm in the States and I'm giving a presentation, people are going to want to know how they're going to profit from it. If I give this presentation in Russia, they're not going to respect me if I don't lead with equations. I have to lead with equations. And in fact, the Russians are a group that if I mention some equation, people go, of course, and sometimes I mention the same equation in other countries and I get these quizzical looks in the eyes, like it's clear I've said something that people don't know about. So there are regional differences like that. I remember visiting Russia shortly after the Berlin Wall fell, in that chaotic time in the 90s. And I remember seeing PCs that had the remnants of fingers on them. It was like all the keys were discolored. You couldn't even tell what was on the keys. And the reason was because they finally got computers. But up until then, they had done a lot just with equations because computers were rare. Personal computers were just unheard of. And so Russians tend to be very well educated in the classical kind of equation kind of way of handling physics and engineering. So, yes, I've seen those kind of differences around the world.
Okay.
But, one of my British friends always said, he said his mother had taught him never at the dinner table should you speak about politics, religion, or reservoir engineering. And it turns out my wife and I, when we travel, we speak of all three. And it's nice to do that because people who are kind of in search of the truth on any one of those three, including reservoir engineering, find a certain camaraderie across cultures. And that's one of the things I see that's common worldwide, that you can talk about certain subjects in a certain way, and you'll get people joining the conversation and enjoying it. And so, same too in science.
I think so too, actually. You were saying before that you can be seen as an expert. How can a young graduate be seen as an expert? What can they do to do that?
A young graduate can't be. And, it's remarkable. A lot of people complain about the young. I don't, because a lot of the young people I meet are incredibly bright. But what I see is because of all the retirements in the industry, and because, when I joined Shell, it was not atypical for a Shell employee to spend 6 months in training. And by training, we're talking serious 8 hours a day, 5 days a week in the classroom. So you feel like you've had a lobotomy when you come out of it, huh? Because you've just been drained by something that you would never see at a university. At a university, you'd be taking 3 or 4 hours a week in one class.
Mm-hmm.
But at a place like Shell or Exxon or Chevron, you'd be taking the class 8 hours a day for 5 days a week. And that was a commitment that the companies made. Because when I joined Shell, and I'm sure when people joined Exxon or Chevron, they talked about their career. And at some point in the 90s, companies let it be known that the career was something that they didn't owe you. And so there became a different kind of attitude towards employees. And as a result, they were not trained as well. And what I see nowadays is that a lot of the training is by people like myself who come from the outside. They're not inside the company training as they were in Shell. And so what I find is young people have a real hunger to learn things, to get kind of basic knowledge, but they find it hard to find the mentors or the teachers that we would in the major oil companies that invested in training in the past.
Do you think that having a mentor and finding a good mentor is quite important to a young person's career?
Oh, yeah. I think yeah, especially because, sometimes you don't know what's important. And it's kind of like the mentor can put you on the right path. When I advise students, like there are many students I meet on LinkedIn, and they ask me about going to graduate school in the United States, and I tell them they should look at the resumes of their professors. And if the professor, especially in engineering, has not spent any time in the industry, there's a real high chance that they may do a PhD or a master's degree on something that means nothing to anybody in the industry. I've seen that happen way too often. What happens is they get a professor who got his bachelor's, master's, and PhD at the same university. So he's never seen the outside world. And he continues to do things that he thinks is important. But if he's not consulting actively in the industry, he doesn't get that kind of feedback that says, wait a minute, what you're doing is a really tiny thing that makes no significance out there in the industry. And he'll produce graduate students who get degrees in that narrow subject area. I have a couple of friends who have been spent substantial amounts of their career in the industry, and they get graduate students with PhDs within 3 years, master's degrees within 1 year, because the students come in, the professor knows what's important, the student works on something important for a year or so, or 3 years for a PhD, and gets out. But for the guy who can't get funding from industry, who's doing something that's not interesting as a professor, then he's going to look at that student as slave labor after about a year or two because they've trained enough that you pay them so little as a student that why not keep them around? So when the student thinks he's finished with a 4-chapter thesis, the professor thinks he needs to do chapter 5 and 6. And that's because the student is productive for the professor, but maybe not advancing his career. So it's really sad to see something like that happen. So yes, I think it's very important in engineering. If we're talking like literature or history or something like that, maybe I wouldn't be so strong on this. But in something as applied as engineering, you need to have people who kind of know what's important to kind of mentor you.
Okay. I never really thought about it like that. When doing a PhD, you would need to really find out whether your mentor was going to be industry based led.
Yes.
Would that be really important?
And if you're not in an engineering field, maybe that doesn't come naturally. But I can tell you that it even doesn't come naturally to students because they're undergraduates. They don't know better. They don't understand motivations of the professors. So you have to kind of put yourself in the professor's shoes. The other thing I tell them is don't be afraid of asking questions you think of out of the box. The first 2 questions I asked my advisor at Princeton was, are you happy here? And the second was, do you have tenure? And what I wanted to know is, I'm about to make a commitment to you and to Princeton, and I want to make sure you're going to be around at the end of that commitment. Now, that seems obvious to an older person, but it doesn't to an undergraduate who's showing up with a professor who's on a pedestal. You wouldn't ask those kind of questions. But I think it's important for students to quiz their advisor about their life at the university and their life in industry, whether they're consulting actively. when I was at Princeton, I think all of the engineering faculty consulted someplace. And at one point, I worked on experiments for NASA in zero gravity environment because my advisor was consulting with NASA. So I had the happy circumstance of having experiments performed with simulations that I did on the space shuttle because they needed to be in zero gravity. And so that's the happy circumstance that occurs when your professor's actively out there in the industry consulting.
Did you find working with NASA, did you find it helpful to your career?
Yeah, to do that kind of stuff, well, a lot of the stuff that I did in graduate school was equation oriented. And what I do today is equation oriented. I apply equations to complex geological models. But the fun is that I have a sense of geology and geophysics and petrophysics, so I can understand what the other people bring to the table. And sometimes engineers don't get that. The disciplinary boundaries can be very strong. At universities, they're terrible. I mean, it's hilarious when some company invites a professor in to tell them how to integrate their teams, because in universities, they don't work at integrated teams. They tend to work with single professors pursuing whatever they're interested in, and they hardly ever cross the interdisciplinary boundary. In fact, it could hurt their career. If they're a young professor, they should be thinking of getting out publications with one name on them, theirs, in their narrow field of interest in order to get tenure at an American university. And if they actually play well with others, as we were taught to do in kindergarten, that could count against them. But in industry, that can be very important. So I find a lot of fun with working with geologists and other people. I mean, like an engineer, I've actually met engineers, they think they can get 6-digit accuracy on an oil field. Can you imagine that? Out to 6 decimal places. And whereas a geologist will talk of a reservoir as if it's a river or a beach or a lake, they talk actually metaphorically. So to think that something like that can be done down to 6 significant figures is actually funny if you step back from it, that people think this way, but they actually do. I was at one software company where a client called in and said, we need 8-digit accuracy on the volumetrics of our reservoir models. And in those days, to get 8-digit accuracy, you needed to do all your calculations in double precision, and that was expensive. And it was amazing to think that any engineer thought he could get 8 digits in a reservoir. It's like geologists would never think that way. And yet, what they have a hard time admitting is that the reservoirs are found by geologists, not by the equation guys. So the people who find these accumulations of oil and gas under the earth are the guys who think metaphorically and get out of the box. And they're not the people who just slavishly solve equations. And that's part of the fun of what I do is I get to work across those disciplines and work with these kind of people. And they're completely different animals.
I was going to ask you, with the decline, well, with some countries maybe going towards net zero, do you think that there's going to be still a huge demand for geologists going forward?
Yeah, I think there is. And here's what I think is sad is some of my students have gone into, say, carbon sequestration or carbon storage. So these are good geologists, right? And they're doing something that detracts from the bottom line. The only way you make money on carbon sequestration is because your government is going to give you a tax break. Now, the way you make money in the oil business is you produce this product that people put into their cars to go to work or to go to school or whatever, that get turned into plastics, that get turned into everything we use, And it's like if you look at civilizations across the world, the ones that are most advanced have the highest intake of energy, and developing countries need more energy. So it's like this net zero stuff is a hoax, and it's been sold to way too many countries. You guys in Britain are probably suffering more from that than I think most, because you're in the ridiculous situation right now where you're basically importing all your oil. And as far as I know, there's not too much happening up there in Aberdeen anymore, where that was kind of a hotbed of activity. And this is all on the hope that net zero is going to accomplish anything. And my wife and I make a point of asking around the world when we meet various people from various cultures, what do you think of the climate change stuff and the net zero? And we found one French geologist who said, oh, it's all bullshit. He said what everybody else says. Okay, but he says, because I work for an oil company, I feel guilty, which I thought was hilarious. So he said, I have to give some credence to it because I work for an oil company. But generally, we haven't found too many people in our industry that feel that way. And I think that's lucky for the world because the world doesn't really need carbon sequestration. It really needs 100 million barrels of oil a day. And if you just think about that for a minute, when you think of what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now, you have tankers that carry 1 million barrels of oil. You need 100 of those tankers to supply the earth for just one day. And it's like we need to keep producing that way. Now, we've got lots of reserves. If you think of what's in Saudi Arabia or in Venezuela or in Canada or in the United States. When I joined the oil industry, well, one of my friends, who was my manager at some point, and he graduated the University of Texas in 1955. And his thesis starts out with this sentence, because the oil's about to run out. That's 1955. Okay. And when I joined the industry, the United States was producing about 5.5 million barrels a day. Now I think we're producing almost 14 million barrels a day. You go, whoa, wait a minute. It was supposed to go down, wasn't it? We were supposed to run out. And it's kind of like, well, then came fracking, and now stuff that we thought was never going to produce oil in literally 1 million years now produces oil. And so there's a revolution. And it's amazing how technology changes the picture. I mean, the United States is close to being independent. So we practically don't require anything coming from the Strait of Hormuz. So which is really remarkable when you think of the picture 40 years ago, 30 years ago, where we were producing only 5.5 million. It's really changed. So I think the world is luckily waking up to the hoax because the icebergs are supposed to be melting for years now. The trouble is that the people who promulgated the hoax actually put times on it. So they gave us a clock to watch, like in 7 years, the icebergs will melt or whatever. And it hasn't happened largely. The earth is going through the kind of natural cycles that we've seen over the millennia. And the best people, the people who know most about the climate, are actually oil company people. Because if you want to understand whether there was a beach there or whether there was vegetation on the beach, you know a lot about the climate of the past. And the oil companies people, the geologists know that the climate has changed over the millennia. One of the professors at the university that I went to at Princeton, a professor of physics, gives a talk, and he talks about carbon levels. The carbon level is like 400 ppm in the air or something like that. He says, well, everybody knows that. So he takes a carbon dioxide monitor, plugs it into the wall, and they find out there's 1,500 ppm in the room. And then it's kind of like, well, wait a minute, it's 400 in the earth, and it's been a lot higher in the past. And we know that from looking at stomata of fossilized plants and things. So don't get me on that topic too much. We can get derailed with net zero. I'm very sad to see my British friends who are no longer working on British fields, which I've worked on with them. They're now having to work at a distance, or maybe they're sitting in the Middle East and no longer able to work in Europe because of the ridiculous policies of the government.
Yeah, that is true. That is very true. So, what advice would you give young graduates leaving university that's coming into industry?
Well, there's a lot to be done in the oil industry that if you think about it, the daunting task of producing 100 million barrels a day, it's still going to be around. I don't know about in the States because at least the technology in the States, the people who do the unconventional, it is really drill, baby, drill. So it's not as technology requiring as conventional oil recovery, where you do a water flood or something like that. Now, that may change because they may wake up to the fact that they've skirted over too much that's technical, that they think that drilling is just the key to it. So they may be a resurgence of kind of technical looking at this. But that will have to come from universities because the research centers of the major oil companies have been obliterated, is the right word. Because over the years, I think that they've decided for one reason or another that people get to do research, I think, between 8 and 10 a.m. on Monday morning, and that's about it. Whereas there used to be a concerted effort. It's not there now. So if you're looking for research, it's going to come from small groups like my own, or it's going to come from universities. But I think there's still a lot to be done in the industry. It's probably more important for people outside of Western Europe and the States. I mean, I saw a lot of young students in Ghana or Nigeria or in the Middle East, and I think they have a very bright future in those places because there's still a lot of oil around. And I think there are going to be companies that want to hire skilled people. But interestingly, when it comes to like the geologist, is there going to be a demand? I would say in the UK, if I were a geologist, I'd feel pretty depressed because those environmental jobs, that geologists take, like carbon sequestration, they pay about one half of what the oil industry pays. And the universities are not honest brokers in letting students know that. And there's a reason for that because the universities get government funding and the government doesn't fund like conventional oil recovery research. That's very rare. They fund the things that are enchanting to them, and one of them is carbon sequestration. So a professor has a kind of different view on the world because he's going to get funding from the government, and the students are going to do research projects that are government funded naturally. So they get a very warped view of what's important. So I advise people if they're going into these disciplines that they go in to work with oily professors, professors who have seen time in the industry and who knows what's important for the industry. What you don't want to do is a thesis on carbon sequestration and then find that there are no jobs in it because the government has decided this is no longer important, which is happening. Okay. And then the next thing you know, you've done a thesis on a topic that nobody in the oil industry is interested in. The big question would be, why did you do that thesis? And that's very sad for the student to confront that. They've spent 4 years of their PhD working on something that, as far as the industry is concerned, is meaningless. So I'd be very careful about advising people about where they should be going and the questions they should be asking.
Okay, so what typical questions should you be asking before you embark on a PhD?
Where your advisor has worked, what kind of work they've done. If your advisor starts talking to you about the importance of carbon sequestration, I would get another advisor right away. I would go to somebody else. And I would ask these questions before I show up at the university, because there are some things that happen at universities that students who are abroad don't understand. So it's like if your funding's going to be dependent upon working for a professor, and the professors are largely doing something that's meaningless to the industry, you don't want to be at that university. And if you find people at that university that you think you want to work on, you should investigate ahead of time whether they're taking students. Because the people that I know who are very good in the industry and teaching at universities have a lot of students working for them. In fact, at the University of Oklahoma, I remember doing an accounting where I found out that about 4 professors in geology, a faculty of about 20, were accounting for about 85% of the students. And it turned out that all of those professors had industry experience. So it turned out that after a while, the students were smart. They went to the people who were going to give them the skills that they could use in industry. They didn't work for the igneous petrologist. Nobody in the oil industry is largely interested in igneous rocks because oil is formed in sedimentary rocks. And so if you learn about igneous rocks or you learn about earthquakes, then you're not really helping out your career in the oil industry very much. And I think you want to be wary of that. So I try to open students' minds to those kind of concerns because coming out of an undergraduate program, you don't think of the practicalities of graduate school.
Okay. And does a lot of PhD student graduates, do they find it easier to get into industry if they've done the right thesis?
Oh, I think so. If they've done the right thing, I think the industry will swoop them up because the industry still hires and it needs to hire because one of the things that's happened in the last, say, 10 years is what they call the great shift change. So people who joined when I joined in 79, and people who joined in the 80s, they're retiring. And because they're baby boomers, they're retiring in big numbers. And so there are huge numbers of retirements. This goes to the mentorship problem that I mentioned earlier. And so the industry needs these people because if you're going to get the job done, they have to get it done with a lot less. And AI is oversold at this point, and you're going to need people to get the job done. So I think the jobs are out there.
Okay. On that positive note, I'm going to end the interview there. That's all the questions I have today. I would like to thank Daniel for your time. That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks for listening and see you next week.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Pleasure, Michelle. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, I'd like to gently encourage you to leave a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts and share the show with another person. You can also follow me on LinkedIn or via my website, www.michellefraserconsultancy.com. Thanks again for listening and see you next week.